I will very happily now welcome our panel, and we'll start off, if we could, with Joana.
Hi, everyone. I'm Joana from Parentkind. I'm the Systems Data and Insight Lead, and Parentkind is a charity that supports parent-teacher associations and anyone with parental and educational responsibilities. We also do policy and research work, and the main reason for us to come to DataKind was to have some help and support in analyzing our membership data. We needed to have our membership data analyzed in a way that we could understand our members, understand the characteristics, understand who they were, and compare members versus non-members. Also support in open data, particularly in deprivation, and overall understand our data better for membership, but also for fundraising and charitable impact.
Brilliant, thanks, Joana. I'll next go to Peyman, who's joining us from Learning with Parents.
That's right. Yeah, I am here from Learning with Parents, and our charity is all about ensuring every child is supported at home to meet their full potential. Because we know that the disadvantage gap that we see at age 11, around half of that comes not from what happens in school, but what happens at home. So how do we make parents and children have engaging educational interactions together, which also research supports that's really makes a difference to the outcomes of those children. And to do that, we have a platform where we encourage schools to set parental engagement activities like fun games or that sort of thing. Often on phone, where parents and kids can play a game together around education, and they learn that way instead of the traditional homeworks. And basically, we've built this platform. We have a number of schools using it. It's around 200 now, and we've been kind of I guess naturally getting all this data from the usage that's been happening. But that's a common problem for small charities trying to have lots of reach. We don't have that much opportunity to do things like dig into our data and stuff. It's very much like we're limited to focusing on delivery as well as not having necessarily the skills to the personnel to do all of that. So we came to DataKind to say, what insights can we get from what we're seeing, and how can we use those to serve, in particular, the disadvantaged pupils who are trying to support to close that gap. And in particular, the things we were looking at was what features of our activities can we look at that make them more fun and accessible, and also like what else in the platform, or how the teachers engage with, or anything like that, or what the pupils are being asked to do is going to make big differences to how it's engaged with by different pupils. And we're able to look at all of these things across pupil premium cohorts and non-pupil premium cohorts, and make sure that we're not just serving those who already have advantage, and that we are actually improving in order to try and support those with disadvantage and close that gap.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. I'm next going to ask Tom Shirley, who is Director of Illustrating Impact, to introduce yourself and set out some of those challenges as well, please.
Yeah, thanks, Lindsay, and nice to meet everyone. So yeah, I'm Director at Illustrating Impact, which is not a charity. It's an organisation I founded, but we help mission-driven organisations. And the mission is to inspire and inform people in a position to make a difference. So through that work, I work with mostly education-based charities on their data challenges. And in this particular role, I was a volunteer, one of the many, which I'm sure we'll get on to. There's hopefully some people are participating in this call, but there's many volunteers. And I took on a role which was to try and help each of those teams basically get a bit of a head start. Because I think one of the challenges I see quite a lot in my work is that charities and other mission-driven organizations have a really good sense of what questions they have and the need within their organizations, but sometimes the technical skills are harder to come by, or the technical people may have less of experience specifically with the open data and kind of this sector. So I was, we'll probably come on to this a bit more later, but I took on a role to kind of advise some of the volunteers to hopefully give them a bit of a head start with the best place to find the open data, and so some of the challenges that the charities on this panel were likely to be having.
Brilliant, thanks, Tom. And last but very much not least, we've got Amanda from you.
Hi there. So yeah, I'm Head of Research and Insight at Youth Sport Trust, which is a national children's charity who use sport and play to bring about a difference in children's education and in their development and their future lives. We do that by training young people and teachers, by delivering programs, delivering national programs like school games, and we also look to influence government and school policy by collating evidence from across the sector. I suppose what brought us to DataKind was really that we need data that's speaking in a language that governments and schools are going to understand, and that shows how physical activity actually ladders through to something that they care about or that they've been targeted on. So for instance, things like outcomes and absences and behaviour. And we came across some amazing data from Sport England, and which merged activity levels with a teacher survey and with school outcomes. We have this amazing set of data, never been seen before by anyone, but we didn't really have the ability or the time or the resources or the software and the skills to be able to do that effectively. And we knew that DataKind did, so we looked to them to sort of start us on that journey, really.
Brilliant, thank you. I think it's one of the things I reflect on and find, really actually quite promising is that the challenges, that charities are talking about today feel like they have moved on from, maybe 10 years ago. I know when I was kind of first introduced to DataKind, it was while I was working at Street League. And for us, it was much more, I would say, basic in terms of, kind of having lots of spreadsheets, no single source of truth. And it feels as though it's much more proactive. And I think, the examples that you've all shared highlight that reality as well. And it's more about how to best invest in the systems that we need rather than making the case or not feeling that there needs to be an investment in the systems. So that's always a nice thing to reflect on with these big challenges, that we are making progress, even if it takes quite a bit of time. So thinking about the data dive projects themselves, I'd really love to hear from each of you what your highlights were and what did it mean, for you or for your organizations and leadership. And I guess, Tom, recognizing that you have that a lot of heavy lifting, I suppose, really with the data dive projects for anybody who's been involved really does happen ahead of that data dive weekend where the kind of magic happens. So I'd love to come to you first for your reflections as a volunteer.
Yeah, thanks, Lindsay. So yeah, as I mentioned in the intros, my main role was the head of the data dive weekend, where all the kind of team volunteers got together and did the interesting work for the charities, which I'm sure they'll talk about. And what I enjoyed the most was kind of bringing together. So as I mentioned, I do a lot of work with education charities. So I'm relatively familiar with where sort of all the open data is from the Department for Education and ONS and those types of things, and what's good for what, essentially. And sort of within that, it can get quite technical in terms of what the best things to use are in terms of if you're trying to measure deprivation, for example, which is quite common. There's about 5 different ways of doing that. So the role I played was to kind of get those notes down for the teams and then have a few meetings with the teams ahead of time to hopefully bring them up to speed, because a lot of the volunteers at DataKind, for people who don't know, are excellent kind of data scientists and data engineers, but tend to not have experience within like the social problem that the data dive is about. So I have some technical kind of background myself, so I'm trying to bridge that gap between what technical things people might want to try with what's actually available and what's, tends to work or doesn't work in this sector. So I really enjoyed kind of working with the teams and working with the charities to work out what might be impactful uses of time to avoid too many dead ends trying to find data or finding stuff which is years out of date or that type of thing. So it's a really good experience.
Brilliant. Thanks, Tom. And I'm going to take a moment just to remind attendees, please do put your questions into the Q&A channel. Amanda, I'm keen to come to you next because I feel like you already alluded to the kind of the art of the possible that came through from your data dive. So would love to hear what your highlights were.
Completely. Well, first I'd say I think I was blown away by the expertise and the passion and the energy just of the day and the people who volunteer. So I think that needs to be said up front. I think, you know, there's so many different people who volunteered on that day, all with different experience, and it's great to get everyone in one room. So I think that was something that really sort of, you know, was great to see, and I think it was lovely to always see that them developing and them learning skills as well as us learning skills. So that whole sort of sharing bit there was great. I think, yeah, it opened our eyes to the possibility of what you can do with data and about using different techniques. There were so many different people coming from different backgrounds that they were approaching it from many different ways. And I think, you know, we always approach it from a certain way because we've got certain software and certain analysts internally, and we can go so far. And I think knowing that it was possible to do this thing, it was possible to map it in a certain way, I think it opened our eyes to what's out there and where we could potentially investigate further. And I think the other interesting thing was it was great to see how we'd got some hunches. So we always thought that this thing probably linked to that, but actually to see that coming through in the data was really exciting, and it helped us hone, I suppose, what we then went on and what we've gone on to do afterwards. So we've got all this data, you could look in so many areas, but I think what they're able to do on the day was to really say, well, here's some areas that probably need more exploring, and we're able to just take that away and say, this is where we can put our resources to maximum effect.
Thanks, Amanda. I can definitely empathize with that feeling of confirming your hunch. We had a similar situation at Magic Breakfast where we used it as an opportunity to kind of sense check our eligibility criteria that we use in terms of which schools that we support, and just sense checking, are those eligibility criteria fit for purpose? And it was such a wonderful moment to see them tackled and asked from every direction, and the answer come back broadly that yes, they are. So yeah, completely understand. Sometimes it's getting confirmation, which is the really valuable piece. Joana, keen to come to you next and hear a bit about your highlights and what happened for you.
Very similar opinion, to be honest. The data dive the weekend, highly energetic, and you see the data analyzed in so many multiple techniques. And yes, you do see the possibilities, and it's just the beginning of a journey, basically. So suddenly you see, for us, for example, one of the main findings was seeing the relationship between our membership and absenteeism rates, which is something that is very important, particularly for Ofsted ratings. And this is when we can start analyzing. It is the beginning of further analysis for sure. And then receiving support on open data, actually pausing and reviewing and rethinking what were we capturing, if that would make sense, and what would make sense in the future to consider, particularly in deprivation data. And this is when we go into obviously data for our charitable impacts and fundraising. And then also, I would like to add the final bit of the project when you receive the report as well. When you receive the report and receive the recommendations, this was highly beneficial for us, I have to say, the report and the recommendations that we can look into specific details, but also overall what we can look into, data capture, data visualization, and so on. I think overall was very, very positive.
Brilliant. That's wonderful to hear how it kind of lives well beyond the weekend itself. And Peyman, keen to come to you next.
Yep, sure. Excuse me. Yeah, I think just on in terms of like other people have said this, a fantastic set of volunteers who were really able to help us on the journey. And something that Lindsey and Tom spoke about at the start about how the process was structured, which I feel like really helped with that engagement as well. It meant like we were working with some people to start with to help refine what we should be trying to dig out of our data, and then working through a phase of with some other volunteers to get our data into a really good state. And what that altogether meant was when it came to the weekend itself, we got so many different kind of ways of cutting and analyzing our data. And the report at the end had so much in it that we can also then work off and see what we can use in future. So as other people have said, it's very much a starting point for us, but even already out of the stuff that we've got out of this, we've got some very, very valuable bits that we're already starting to use and share. One thing, for example, that came out of the data that we looked at is, so we have as part of our platform, parents and kids reading together at home, and the schools asked them to read X number of times a week to, with their child. They asked parents to read this many times a week to complete their week's kind of work that they're meant to be doing in terms of reading with their child. And it's typical for schools to ask parents and children to read together 5 evenings a week. What our data showed is that we were seeing some schools who are asking parents and children to read 3 times a week, and some schools who are asking parents and children to read 5 times a week. And we could see that actually for the pupils who were not disadvantaged, that didn't make that much difference to how much they engaged and how much reading they did. But for the ones who were more disadvantaged, there was a significant difference, and they were less likely to engage as much if they were set a higher target. And that's something that already, like, we've been able to say to schools, well, the indicative thing that we've looked at here is that you could be setting a lower target, because that will help you with engaging the pupils you're most trying to engage, and you're most care about making sure that they're being supported at home. So so that's already like a tangible kind of thing we've done. Other elements like looking at the types of activities we've got and being able to categorize and say which of the features of what the activity looks like has a statistically significant difference between how it's engaged with pupils who are disadvantaged and pupils who are not. Like, those are insights which we can then feed back into our content development and thinking. It's been super valuable. In terms of the next steps from that, so I talked about that, for example, that sort of insight. We've actually then since then been speaking to a university who might be interested in doing a project with us off the back of this, to be able to more formally and properly investigate and get insights out, which we can also more broadly share with the sector, and, you know, try and really drive forwards what organizations and schools might be doing in this area to make sure that we are addressing that disadvantage gap. So absolutely huge for us. And of course, like, just that the process has given us such a wealth of, like, you know, starting points off which we can jump and take things forwards in different ways. Yeah, somebody else mentioned the report at the end as well that we got. Within that, one of the things that the volunteers had very quickly put together in a day was like a mini dashboard based on the data that had available, that we could explore some of how people are engaging with our activities. And the report came with like a nice write-up of like what we might want to do if we want to take this forwards and do something with our live data. And having those types of starting points makes a huge difference to us as to whether we're going to then be able to enable these data capacities in our organization. Because if I've got the legwork there to be able to go and say, well, look, this is what it's going to take to do this dashboard. It's all, you know, we've got access to the expertise to try and support with it or whatever. It's a huge difference compared to saying, oh, well, it might be nice to do something with our data. So yeah, I think for us it's been huge in moving us forwards on that journey.
Fantastic, thank you. I'll just share I think the highlight, I don't know if that's quite the right word, but the thing that I've appreciated most is how I'll frame it, from the data dive that I've been involved with at Magic Breakfast and also the one from Street League, was we actually went into them asking, where are we not succeeding? You know, who are we not reaching? And I suppose almost turning sometimes how we think about things in the charity sector on its head, and really looking to challenge ourselves, or at least to shine a light on those that we weren't necessarily capturing in our, as it were, traditional theory of change recording, because we're not actually reaching them to bring them into our data set in the first place. And I think, just to kind of absolutely reinforce what everyone's really spoken to, that the data dive weekend is kind of a great, you know, jumping off point, and you get so many possible routes and things to take forward. And it was actually, ours was back in November of last year, so, you know, several months ago, and it's still a live conversation of, you know, what are we doing with that insight that we had from the DataKind report, and, you know, how does that inform our plans for next year or even the year after? Because some of the things that it unlocks really are kind of quite big strategic thoughts and considerations. So again, for the audience members, maybe thinking about the timing of working with DataKind in relation to your strategic planning cycle or your strategic review cycle, not just kind of the plugging the holes in all of our collective data systems and dams that we're always fighting hard to improve and develop. So we'll move on to another kind of area which has come through as a commonality in everybody's projects, which is looking at open data or external data sets. Everyone's data dives, I think, actually leveraged those open data sets. And I thought maybe as a starting point, not to assume knowledge, Tom, we could start with you. Maybe you could explain what an open data set is, and a little bit of an overview of how you've seen those come to I suppose, have an impact or add value to some of these data dive weekends.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, a lot of what I do at Illustrating Impact is using the open data, which is basically anything which is published openly online, typically. So that would be generally by the Department for Education and Education or other agencies like DWP or the ONS, for example, with the census data. So it's any information which is openly available online. And I think one of the roles I played with this work and in my sort of day job is making what's available kind of accessible and also useful. So I'd say those are kind of two different steps, really. So it's technically it's already available, but typically it's not accessible. Either it's hidden away, or when you find it, it's just like a huge spreadsheet that doesn't make much sense. So that's kind of step one. And then the follow on from that in kind of a lot of the DataKind work and other work I do is then also, as well as making it accessible to people, is trying to work out how to actually make it useful, which can be a bit of a follow-on step, which is tricky for various reasons. Often the data is a bit out of date, or it's not at the level that you ideally want it to be at. So you kind of have to work around these limitations, given that I think it can still be a very valuable resource in terms of identifying needs would be one big area. So if you're trying to target work, then you can use this information to at least get a proxy of which schools or which areas might benefit the most from your particular type of support. And then there's also kind of an impact discussion, which gets a bit more complicated. But if you're interested in kind of tracking changes based on your work, it can work for that. So yeah, I think it's a tricky one, and I'll let other people talk about how they use it. But I've kind of I'm always trying to make it more accessible and more useful. And after I stop chatting here, I'll just put a shameless plug in the chat for something which I've been working on along these lines in the education sector, which people may be interested in, but not to derail this conversation. But I'll drop something in that people may be interested in, which is my latest attempt to kind of make this stuff really useful and impactful for particularly in the education sector.
Thanks, Tom. And there's absolutely nothing shameless about a plug that helps further the conversation in the sector. So thank you for sharing that. Joana, keen to hear from you next in terms of how open data sets have been or are being used at Parentkind.
So basically, we use membership data, our data set, but also open data from schools information and deprivation data. We are now starting to use also Scottish data as well, and we need to expand to Ofsted data. So we will use lots, to be honest, lots in open data. So DataKind gave a great support on this, particularly on the deprivation, as I said before, and the free school meals, pupil premium, and going into more pupil need here. And so definitely, I think the main challenges for us in terms of open data is how accessible it is and understanding the most relevant for us. Because there is a lot, but we might not need everything. So it's just making these judgment here.
Brilliant, thank you. And Amanda, I'll come to you next in terms of kind of what your learnings, reflections, challenges were from your weekend.
Yeah, so I mean, talking about I suppose open data and what we did. So I mean, I think as I said, that what we were using was Sport England data, which was open in the sense that everyone could access it, but it wasn't easy to access. And I think that was quite an interesting one for us. So you had to sign a data sharing agreement to get the data. So I think that's an interesting piece there about how open it is open, you know, because there's a lot of work there. I think another reflection was we've used open data in the past, for instance, to help us better target. And it's really useful stuff, but it needs a lot of processing to get it into a format that's useful for YST and for sector partners. So it's really understanding up front how you best cut that data and how the requests you ask of a huge data set, because it's very easy to just dive into a data set and not really know what you're looking for. So I think it was certainly helpful to have a lot of planning beforehand before the weekend to really think about what questions you really wanted to ask of that data, to get the prioritization behind it, and to think about how you wanted to cut that data, whether you wanted to bucket it, etc., to make it meaningful. Because I think if not, you can almost get overwhelmed by the amount of stuff you've got and not really sort of focus on it. So I think the prep thing was really important for us. And then I think also knowing limitations. So I think what we learned about that weekend is the data we were working with was weighted data. It's very complicated. So some stuff certainly that YST can do going forward, but also knowing that there's probably a point at which we will need to ask for help and understanding where that is and the people out there that might be able to help us beyond the DataKind weekend to really delve into that data a little bit more. So a lot of learning about how we could better use it, I suppose.
Thanks, Amanda. And having previously worked in sport for development, I can completely empathise with the complexity of Sport England open data sets. So yes, I completely understand what you're saying. And well done to you and the team for navigating it. And then last but not least, Peyman, I'm conscious I don't think you guys leveraged open data sets per se in your project, but had quite fruitful conversations. So keen to hear from you, you as well.
Yeah, that's exactly right. So, a lot of the conversations that we had in the project and the build-up, and again, another element outside of just the insights that we got that's been really valuable was talking about when we were exploring what data could we bring in, what could we be working with for this project. We looked at things like the indices of deprivation and school data and that sort of thing, and how it might relate to our data set. In the end, we did focus on this project to the data that we gathered on our platform in terms of the scope of what we're doing here. And that gives us a great jumping off point to be able to work on that stuff going forwards as well. Again.
Brilliant, thank you. And I think the one point I would add, just from our experience and what we're trying to kind of, I suppose, do with the DataKind project is thinking about the value that open data sets can have for your advocacy work, because it then means that, you know, in the case of Amanda, for instance, when you speak to Sport England about your findings and your work, you can relate it straight back to their data, their kind of impact and conversations. So I do think it sometimes helps bridge the gap between the policymakers, the decision makers, and charities who rely upon that open data set. And maybe if we highlight that we use it enough, they'll make it slightly more accessible and easy to use for us all as well.
That's true.
So we have got to the point now where we're going to start coming to everyone for questions, and I can see we've got a few coming through in the Q&A, which is fantastic. But to buy you all attendees a bit more time, and also to make sure that we don't miss out on any gems of insight or reflection from our panelists, I'll just open the floor if there's anything from the panelists that, you know, following the conversation that we've had this evening and what you've heard from others or thought about just through your own answers and kind of information, anything that you'd like to share, add. Is there an absolute takeaway that people must hear before we open the floor for that Q&A session?
I'd sort of follow on. So the advocacy piece, I think you said at the end of that. So I think that's really key. So speaking a common language, and I think when you can use open data sets and when you can produce sort of solid data, then it really helps speak the language of the people that we're trying to influence. And I think that's key in everything that we try to do within YST. We try to collaborate across the whole sector to pull that data together. And I think if we've got some common language across some of these largest data sets, that's when you've really got power behind things. So yeah, it's great to be able to delve into that and to use that data.
Brilliant. Well, I will hold a moment, but I think we've had all of the reflections and insights. So thank you for that.